Okay, everybody around the world who is joining us for Hospitality Tomorrow, welcome back. It's me again, Stephen. I'm delighted to say we still have fabulous figures for participation. We're well over 2,500 people who are online with us right now, and I'm really very pleased about that because, as I promised you before we all rushed out to make a cup of coffee and enjoy a snack, we've now got a wonderful keynote speaker. We've made an effort right from the start of this event to focus on the realities of today, but also the importance of beginning to think about tomorrow and about both the positives as well as the challenges that come with the thoughts of COVID-19, what happens next, and to consider that in greater detail right now from the point of view of economics and what is happening to the global economy right now and what we might begin to think about for the future. I'm joined, as you can see, by Roger Bootle. Now, just to give you a little bit of background on Roger, he is, it is true to say, one of the UK's most respected economists. He's currently chairman of Capital Economics. It's one of the world's largest independent macroeconomic consultancies, but his depth of knowledge in economics goes very far back and in a whole host of different guises. In the corporate sense, he was chief economist at HSBC. He's been a leader at Manchester Business School. He's advised British governments and British parliamentarians over many years on different aspects of economic policy. He won one of the most prestigious world prizes in economics, the Wolfson Prize. He's written a whole host of books. I won't bore you with all their titles, except to say one of them was Making a Success of Brexit, which I'm going to make a point of reading over the next few months because I need to know what the answers to that is. But that's not what we're about today, Roger. What we really want to hear from you today is a sort of quick tour of the horizon of what is happening to the global economy right now. And clearly much of that is going to be grim, but also your thoughts on the future, what comes next, what we might expect despite all the uncertainty right now, what we might expect to see in the coming months. So that's by way of introduction. It's great to see you on screen. I know you're as much a lover of computers as I am, but you made it on time. So I'm going to hand to you. And after your presentation, Roger, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. But over to you now.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and good morning to you all. I'm going to talk about a few topics, 5 actually. First of all, I want to say something about how soon the economic recovery will come and how strong it will be. I'll talk about the lingering effects of public debt, something about the effect on consumers, and indeed some remarks about the hospitality sector particularly. Then I'll say something about the long-lasting effects of the balance between the private sector and the state. And finally, something about how different countries are positioned for the future. So first of all, what about the recovery? How strong and how soon will it be? Now, the first thing to say, you're not going to thank me for this, is no one knows. Don't worry, I won't stop there. This really is completely unprecedented. We don't know. There's no body of wisdom we can fall back on. But let me say that I think the best, not just a hope, I think belief, is that we will see something like a sharp recovery once we've passed the worst. Now, as far as the current position is, we're going to see some dramatic drops in GDP. From peak to trough, I think a number of countries are going to see something like a fall of 20%. It's going to be the worst economic performance in a short period of time since the Great Depression. And in some cases, it's going to be even worse than that. But I think the chances are that they'll be quite short-lived, and we'll then get a very sharp recovery, making, if you like, a sort of V shape. If you were to draw a graph of GDP, I think it would be a sort of V shape. Now, that sounds good, the very sharp recovery. I think it is good. However, I believe, not everyone believes, but I believe that if you imagine that graph with a V shape in it, we will never regain the lost output described by that V shape. That's gone for good. And the question then is, what happens afterwards? After we've got up the far side of the V, what's life going to be like then? Well, some people think that it's going to be an awful lot better, actually, than it would have been without this this crisis, they take an Austrian view. They even talk about cleansing the economic system, productivity rebounding, all those sorts of things. I wish I could believe that. Frankly, I don't. I think the best we can hope for is that we get back to the sort of level we would have been at anyway, but we don't make up for that loss described by the V shape in the graph of GDP. But thereafter, growth continues pretty much as it would have been. That is my hope, and I think there are pretty good grounds for believing that something like that will indeed happen. Now, what about public debt? In just about all countries, we're going to see massive increases in public debt. And the question is, how do we deal with those? Well, some people think we should deal with them by slashing government expenditure and raising taxes. I think that would be precisely the wrong thing to do. Some people are suggesting that inflation is inevitable as a way of liquidating the debt. Some people are even saying it will be a good thing. I don't think that's right, either of those views. I think the appropriate strategy is to ensure we get decent rates of economic growth and basically live with the higher level of debt. And obviously, we've got to make sure that we don't, once the crisis is over, drive or put up with government borrowing levels very, very high. We can't afford that. But I think we should essentially just put up with the debt and try to work it down gradually in real terms and as a share of GDP. That's what I suggest should happen. And I think it's what will happen, at least in the UK and the US. I'll say something more in a moment about what may happen in some other countries. Now, a few words about the effect on consumers and particular reference to hospitality. There's bound to be a weakening of consumer balance sheets. Some people, of course, are in a desperate situation now. And as and when the economy returns to normal, there's still going to be a lingering effect, of course, on the financial position of many consumers. Over time, of course, that will be made up for by continued economic growth and hopefully continued growth of real wages. And I'm anticipating that when the restrictions come off, there's going to be a great surge of demand for all the services of the hospitality sector. Travel, eating out, hotels, all those things are, I think, going to experience a short-term surge. However, that's not necessarily going to be the case, of course, sustained for the next year or two afterwards, because people will have suffered this big dent to their wealth position, their balance sheet position. And I think we could then enter a second phase of disappointment for the sector as those realities hit home. However, after not that long, I would expect something really rather different to happen. The memories of this and the financial legacy of this episode, ghastly episode, will fade. And I happen to think, I've thought for a long time, that the medium-term prospects for this sector are extremely good. Because as we get richer, and believe it or not, after this ghastly phase, we will be getting steadily richer. And I'm optimistic about what things like AI can do for us. As we get richer, I think the evidence is that people more and more won't be wanting more things. What they'll be wanting is more experiences of a sophisticated sort, but also experiences of a sort that we're familiar with. They want to be going out, they want to be traveling, they want to be experiencing all sorts of things. So that, I think, is going to be good for the sector in the medium term. And although things are going to be difficult, I think we will find that before long, that torrent, that tide of good medium-term prospects will overwhelm the difficulties, the lingering difficulties from this ghastly episode. Just a word about business travel, because that, I think, is a big question mark about this. After we're over all this, obviously people will have had a remarkable experience. Many people would have learned to work from home. They will have learned to have virtual meetings like this one. And the question is, are business people going to go back to the same level of travel as they had before? And there's a possibility, it seems to me, that that won't happen. So I'm more optimistic for this sector about leisure travel than I am about business travel. Now, my fourth topic, which I said I'd touch on briefly, was something about the relations between individual and the state, or if we like, markets and the state. And I'm touching on this because I think that this is a fascinating time, were it not so ghastly, for what the questions it raises about the role of government. This event has par excellence been something in the public realm, and indeed public health and the protection of public health is, in essence, a public good. And it's, of course, governments that have had to address this. The question is, when this is all over, are we going to go back to the sort of division between the markets and the state that we had before? And I rather suspect, actually, that we're not, that there will be a lot of pressure for governments to have a larger role. And I'm actually quite worried that we'll see a movement among people at large, against companies, against business, against capitalism, and against markets. Public good, private bad. You're already seeing signs of this. And so after the crisis is over, more difficult for companies to pay large dividends, difficult for companies to pay large executive bonuses, all those sorts of things. Now, I'm very much hoping that governments, including this one in Britain and in the States and a number of other countries, are going to resist this mood. Obviously, there are some areas where the public sector is going to have to be larger, public health systems better prepared for a return of something awful like this again. But we really, really, really shouldn't, I think, derive lesson from all this, that governments are better at running the economy and society than is the private sector. That would be a mistake. We've got to guard against it, I think, very closely and powerfully. Now, lastly, I thought I'd say something about how different countries are positioned by this awful crisis and what will happen in the recovery from it. Now, I'm relatively optimistic that the UK and the US will do okay and will manage the recovery relatively well. And that's partly because of the nature of their debt markets. They'll be able to, I think, to live with these higher levels of public debt. And I don't think they'll address this problem badly. Looking further afield to Asia, China, this is a very interesting case. I really think the Western world's attitude to China will not be the same again. Now, some weeks ago, there was a suggestion in a number of places that lots of people in the West would be full of admiration for China, the way that it coped with the crisis, and admiration, if you like, for the authoritarian system under which China operates. More recently, that's given way to, I think, a very different sort of feelings, not least because of the way that China handled the outbreak of the virus, first of all, suppressing the news, deliberate use of misinformation. And the reaction of many people in the West after this crisis is over is going to say, crikey, you know, these people are difficult, they're dangerous, we don't want much to do with them. So I think actually that this is going to accelerate the move away from globalization, which was underway anyway. And I think it's going to, in a lot of people's minds, think that they should cut back on reliance on China and probably cut back even on trade links with China. So that's one, I think, big consequence. Lastly, within Europe, I think there's potentially some major effects in that this has not shown the EU to the best advantage, this crisis. The immediate reaction of countries within the EU was nationalistic. Germany effectively closed its borders to exports of medical equipment, including to Italy, which desperately needed these. This has been the response of most European countries throughout the crisis. Borders were closed. The EU authorities were able to do next to nothing. So there was a return to nationalism, if you like, not in an ideological sense, but in regard to what people actually did and what was the source of the help and the control in this ghastly crisis. People looked to their own national governments. Italy is a particularly acute case because Italy, of course, was in difficulties before this crisis, very low growth, very high public debt, and without much prospect of that getting better. The blow to the Italian economy from all this is going to be devastating. Italian public debt, simply dreadful. I think one impact of all this is actually going to be to increase the strains on the Eurozone and on the EU itself. Now, the EU could go one of two ways, it seems to me. It's possible that out of this crisis will come the move towards greater solidarity. That's to say, there will be the issue of so-called corona bonds, there'll be a sort of fiscal union to match the monetary union, and from all that, Europe will get closer and more integrated. It's quite possible. But I think there's actually more likely that things will go in the opposite direction, and that Italy may end up leaving the Eurozone and even the EU itself. What I don't think is likely to happen is that the EU will remain unscathed. It's always been a sort of halfway house. I think this really is crisis time for the EU. It's going to go either one way or the other. Well, thank you very much for listening. That's assuming, of course, you have been.
Well, that's a finish, Roger, because I was listening very closely, and I suspect everybody else was too. It was a fascinating tour of the global economy and your assessment of not just where it is now, but where it's going. I think takeaways from it are that, you know, in the medium term, you sound like a relative optimist. The description of V-shape with a rather rapid return to growth, a surge in demand, as you put it. The problem is that you did also say, I have to be fair to you, you did say that there's huge uncertainty around this, but the very nature of the virus is that until we get a vaccine, it's hard to see how we get out of this. And that could make it a very long-running, massive drag on the world economy.
Yes. I mean, my remarks were predicated on recovering from the virus. And obviously, I'm no medical expert or expert on pandemics. So it is perfectly possible, isn't it, that actually we don't ever really, in the foreseeable future, get over the virus. That's to say, it doesn't properly go away, and we're in constant fear of it coming back. Maybe it does come back in perhaps some mutated form. Now, if those things happen, then of course the economic environment is actually very, very different. I think even in those circumstances, though, actually, I suspect that governments would not be able to pursue the policies that they've pursued so far. I mean, let's be clear about this. The damage that the virus has done to the world economy has come not from the virus itself, but from the measures to deal with the virus. It's the lockdown that's damaged the economy. This is actually quite different, you see, from things to which it's been compared before. People talk about being in wartime, and there are some similarities with the wartime situation, although they're not. I would describe the current situation really as being a bit of a mixture, if you like, between a massive war and the Great Depression. But with wars, and the Second World War, I think, being a prime example, what you have is the destruction of physical capital, as well as, of course, lots of people being killed. And that combination, the destruction of human capital, people, and physical capital, makes it impossible to have a proper recovery very soon. You've lost something real. This is different. We've lost no physical capital, and the number of people who've died so far, although it's ghastly, is comparatively small, and many of them, of course, are old, so their economic impact is not so great. That's not the economic problem. The economic problem is caused by shutting the economy down. So when I was talking about the V-shaped recovery early on, that's predicated, to answer your question, Stephen, on the idea that, you know, we get on top of the virus, we don't all live in fear of it coming back, and come next winter, we don't see a resurgence of it. If I'm wrong about that, then I'm also wrong about the V-shaped recovery.
Yeah, and I do take your point about this not being about destruction of capital assets or infrastructure or anything else. But nonetheless, there is something really interesting which your analysis doesn't really give much weight to, and that is behavioral change, long-term behavioral change as a result of what we are now living through. And it just seems to me, you know, when you address directly the prospects for the hospitality industry, that you were assuming people's behavior going forward will be pretty much the same as in the past, or perhaps even more intensified in the desire to travel, the desire to get new experience. It seems to me there's a very real possibility the behavioral impact in the long term will be quite the reverse. People will become more risk averse. They'll wonder much more about whether it's wise to travel far afield. They may, to put it in a very British way, hunker down mentally more than they did in the past. That would have a huge economic impact.
I quite agree. I mean, in my brief remarks, I didn't have time to do justice, as it were, to the variety of phases that I see in the future. I talked initially about a sort of relief rebound, where I think we're all going to rush out to the pub and restaurants and heaven knows whatever else as soon as we can. I'm sure it's going to be massive celebration. Then after that comes, if you like, the hangover. And the hangover, and you're right, I didn't say enough about this, has got two parts to it, really. One is financial. It's the fact that, you know, we are not as well off as we were before. We have bigger debts, fewer assets. And that will therefore constrain what we feel we want to, how much we want to spend. But there's also the points you're making that we'll also think, hang on a minute, is all this safe? Do we really want to, you know, go out as much, go as far afield? Do we want to travel as much? And I think that will be there for a time. But, you know, I really cannot see that lasting long. People do forget these things and they want to enjoy themselves. I mean, in America after the First World War, America was not being that badly affected by the First World War, unlike Europe. It was, however, quite seriously affected by the Spanish flu outbreak. And what happened after that? Well, what happened was the Roaring Twenties. You know, no greater period of optimism and prosperity and all the rest of it in American history probably can you think of than that. And in China, SARS was pretty huge. I mean, if I was showing a chart of GDP for China, I talked about this V shape that we're going to get now, I think. Well, you can see a V shape in China, the Chinese data. The economy subsequently recovered, but didn't stop Chinese people traveling and going out and so on and so forth. So you're right. I think there will be that factor. I just don't think it'll last very long.
And one more before I'm going to introduce you questions from our participants all around the world, because they've got lots of questions for you. But one more from me, because it struck me very clearly that your analysis of sort of, if I can put it bluntly, winners and losers post-COVID in terms of the world economy, put China, frankly, in the losers category, because you seem to be saying that a lot of people around the world will look at China with a new level of skepticism about the way they organize their economy, about the way they tell the truth about what is going on inside their country. And you suggested that might filter through to a different attitude to trade with China, and therefore presumably to the hugely important Chinese tourism business and the numbers of Chinese people who now travel around the world and do much to fuel the growth of tourism around the world. Are you seriously suggesting that all of these businesses, some of whom are joining us today, who've built a business model which, has a very strong foundation in business with China, may revisit that?
Well, I don't think, economics on the whole isn't characterized by sudden stops and drops in things. There are trends and things adjust gradually. Now, there are large parts of business with China which will carry on unchanged and indeed continue to grow. Now, you mentioned one, visitors from China. I'm quite sure that people in the West won't want to stop that. And I don't think Chinese government or other organizations in China will want to restrict Chinese people visiting other parts of the world. And as China gets richer, as it will continue to do, Chinese people on average will have the greater ability to go on spending money around the world. So I think that will continue. I was talking more about, if you like, governmental relations and the restrictions that they might place on trade, and less so in services and people, more, I think, in goods. I mean, let's take, for instance, the decision in Britain to allow the Chinese company Huawei a significant part in the development of our 5G network. That came in for a lot of stick from the Americans and others. I think we might well see that decision revisited. Indeed, lots of MPs are arguing that it should be revisited. Now, I think actually there was a move away from globalization before all this happened. People were getting increasingly concerned for a variety of reasons. So I just think this will probably accentuate that trend, but it does not mean that we aren't going to see an awful lot more Chinese visitors. I hope it doesn't mean, I don't think it means that, an awful lot more Chinese visitors traveling around the world.
Good. Well, thank you for that, Roger. I'm now looking at my various devices here to bring in some of the questions that people joining us around the world have sent to me. Here's one. And give brief answers, Roger, because we can get through as many as possible.
Sure.
I'd love to hear from Roger any thoughts on unemployment levels that are rising across different industries around the world, particularly hospitality. How do you see global economies mitigating what could be real socio-economic risks that come with rapid, substantial rises in unemployment?
Well, of course, some governments, including the British one, have taken steps to try to ease the financial problems originating from all that. Frankly, I think the answer to your questioner is it all depends on how rapid the recovery is. If it follows the sort of path that I've suggested, that's to say we get a V-shaped recovery, we never recover the lost output described by that V in the chart of GDP, but we get back to something like where we would have been anyway, then I don't think there will be major lasting impacts on unemployment. There won't be social unrest and so on and so forth. Now, some people, of course, will have been quite badly affected relative to others. And one of the interesting things at the moment, I think, and this potentially could give rise to a lot of resentment, is that by and large, people in the public sector are economically quite secure. They don't get made redundant. They've got the state behind them. The people who suffered worst, in my experience at the moment, are entrepreneurs. Now, okay, if you're mega rich, you can stand it. But what about those, lots and lots of people, maybe self-employed, they may have a very small business, and they may not figure very large in the unemployment stats, but boy, they're important to the economy. And so many of them have suffered disproportionately compared to, let's say, your ordinary public sector employee. So I'm optimistic that as long as the economy has this sort of V shape, that the effects on unemployment will be recovered quite shortly. Now, there'll be some lingering effects, of course, but if we get back to the sort of output that we would have been at anyway, then I think we'll get back to the sort of employment level we would have been at anyway. Now, if the more bearish scenario that you, Stephen, were outlining earlier on, if that were to take place, that's to say we would really, in the foreseeable future, get over this virus effectively. People are worried about it. Maybe there's a recrudescence of it. Perhaps there's some mutated form. In those sorts of conditions, then obviously we have high unemployment for a very long time, and heaven knows what the political and social consequences of that would be. They would be absolutely desperate.
They would. I do think politicians are beginning to think about that and worry about it, to be honest. But here's one for you as an economist. But I suspect this question could tempt you to give me a very long answer, but I'm going to demand a very short answer. It says, Roger, this is an economic problem right now that has entered the financial sphere, whereas, for example, the Great Recession, I wonder if they mean Great Recession or Depression, but anyway, was a financial problem that then entered the economic sphere. Is there a difference between the two in terms of the nature of the recovery?
I don't think so, particularly. I mean, fortunately, in most countries, the financial system didn't go into this crisis very weak. I think because of what we experienced in 2008-9, it was stronger. In fact, you could say, historians may say, looking back, this is a remarkable thing to say, I'm not sure I quite believe it, but anyway, I'll say it. The historians may say that we were lucky to have experienced the financial crisis of 2007-9, because that enabled us to strengthen the system and enabled us to take stronger public action than we would have done in this crisis had we not had that experience.
Roger, today we're talking about we're well over 2,600 participants, and they're truly from all over the world. And the question is, what about global leadership? We saw a real attempt by politicians after the financial crash to come together through G20 and other formats to really find a cooperative, collaborative way of recovering the world economy. We're not really seeing that yet around COVID-19. Do you worry about that?
Yes, I do. I said that with regard to the EU, the response has been really one from national governments, and I think the EU personally is going to struggle to come up with a unified response. But more globally, there's a real difficulty and a deterioration since the financial crisis, because since then, what we've seen is a worsening of relations between the United States and China. We've seen a worsening of relations between most of the world and Russia. And of course, we have in the White House a president who's not the greatest fan of globalization or global cooperation. And putting those things together, it doesn't look good. I hope that what we will see is something like a revival of an effort by the G20 of the sort of thing that happened after the financial crisis. Every country really is in this together. If countries were to go down the nationalistic line big time with regard to trade restrictions, that would actually worsen the current economic crisis. That we desperately need global cooperation.
You know better than I that the trend in global politics and economics was towards much more nationalism.
It was,
And I don't really see why, frankly, with the nature of the leadership we have from Russia, China, the United States, why that's going to change post-COVID.
Well, you might be right, in which case, our escape from the crisis would be because of actions undertaken by national governments, which collectively would add up to quite a lot, but they wouldn't be globally coordinated. And of course, it's quite possible, as you're hinting, that things with regard to different countries' attitudes and actions with regard to other foreign countries actually makes things worse. I think that's quite possible. But you said with the sort of leadership we've currently got, well, of course, we may not necessarily stay with the leadership we've currently got.
Indeed. We're almost out of time. I'm going to do one very quick one. And that is, Roger, surely the real question here is all about debt. We're going to emerge from this with new and massive debts. And is it going to be time to talk about debt forgiveness?
Well, if by that you mean governments writing off their own debt, as it were, cancelling it, or were you talking about the indebtedness of individuals and companies? I don't think that it's a viable option for governments to cancel their own debt. I'm not sure what good it does anyway, because there are both people, organisations in the economy who have that debt as an asset, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and so on and so forth. I think there will be parts of the economy, the private sector, where the appropriate thing to do will be for their lenders to actually write the debt off. And whether they willingly do that or not, it'll simply be the case that some of it will get written off anyway, because the people they've lent the money to simply will not be able to repay it. So there's going to be an awful lot of bad debt one way or another. And in some cases that may well be recognised in a generous spirit. In others, I suspect rather less so.
Roger, it's been really interesting talking to you. You've surprised me a little bit by being more optimistic, actually, and positive than I thought you might be, which is great, because today is about trying to find the positive as well as be realistic about the current situation. So I thank you so much for that. And the other thing I should say is that we've had loads and loads of questions for you, which suggests that people right around the world have been very engaged with your analysis. So thanks a million for doing that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Great to see you. Thank you very much indeed.